On April 10th, 1834, a fire broke out at 1140 Royal Street in New Orleans, Louisiana. The house itself had already been the subject of rumors because its owner, Madame Marie Delphine LaLaurie, had been accused of mistreating her slaves. When the property caught fire, people rushed in and were shocked at what they found. They saw slaves in chains, in various states of starvation, tortured, and on the verge of death, but not because of the fire. Madame LaLaurie and her family fled the city in the hours after the fire, making their way over to France, and LaLaurie never returned to face punishment for her crimes. So today, I want to talk about the story of Madame LaLaurie, the woman accused of torturing and murdering her slaves in the early 19th century, that's the 1800s. She's become a local legend of sorts and features in a ton of ghost stories and in haunted murder ghost tours if you go down to New Orleans. But for many of us out here, particularly my fellow millennials, you might have first learned about her from the third season of American Horror Story, Coven, where Madame Delphine LaLaurie was played by the incredible Kathy Bates. And for those of you who haven't seen the show, I'll give you the briefest of summaries. American Horror Story Coven takes place in the present, which at the time was 2013, if you can believe it. The plot focuses on the descendants of a group of witches from Salem who fled Salem in 1692 and ended up living in New Orleans. And while in New Orleans, the coven comes across a handful of ghosts and famous entities from various different time periods. Delphine LaLaurie is one of them, obviously, but we also meet Marie Laveau, who is a Creole voodoo practitioner, sometimes also called the Voodoo Queen. There's also Papa Legba, who is a deity from the West African Vodun tradition and religion that was included in the syncretic Creole voodoo religion. We also met the jazz-loving Axeman of New Orleans, a serial killer active in 1918 and 1919. And, of course, my absolute favorite woman on the planet is in the show as herself, Stevie Nicks. She plays the White Witch. She's not a character from New Orleans history. I just really love Stevie Nicks. And I wanted to mention her. And her 1997 performance of Silver Springs, played at the Burbank, in Burbank, California, lives rent-free in my head. She, in that performance, is my Roman Empire. I really like Stevie Nicks. Now, the Delphine LaLaurie, played by Kathy Bates, showed viewers a sadistic, evil, torturous woman who was also immortal, but I'm not going to get into the plot because the woman is not actually immortal, right? Now, in the show, she used the organs of her slaves to create a balm, right, or a serum of sorts to help keep her young. She bathed in their blood. She locked slaves in her attic, where she experimented on them and tortured them. It was bloody, it was violent, it was creepy, and it was awesome. Now, you may just think, well, okay, but that's all fiction. It's just a TV show, right? And you'd be right to assume that. Of course the legend is going to be exaggerated for the show. However, much like what we saw with the Blood Countess Elizabeth Bathory, one of my earlier episodes, her story has very much been exaggerated over the years. Sensationalized. In fact, author Stanley Arthur wrote that, quote, "I have always thought that Madame LaLaurie was the first victim of yellow journalism." End quote. So who was the real Madame LaLaurie? What's her story? Was she a vile torturess and murderer, or was much of her dark legend fictionalized? Today, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into her story. First, we'll start with the historical context. What did New Orleans in the 1820s and 30s look like? We need to understand the world Madame LaLaurie lived in before we can place her story in context. We need to look at it also through contemporary sources, through an early 19th century lens, not a 21st century one. After that, we'll take a look at her story. First, the gross, bloody legend that inspired the Kathy Bates version that we saw in American Horror Story Coven. But then, we'll take a look at the real Madame LaLaurie using tangible evidence compiled by New Orleans researchers like Carolyn Morrow Long, who wrote the book Madame LaLaurie, Mistress of the Haunted House. It's a good read. I liked it a lot. So was she a torturer and a murderer? And if so, how much of her legend is true? So let's get started. Now, considering we're talking about a woman accused of torturing her slaves, our context today needs to be about slavery in and around New Orleans in the early to mid 19th century, that's the 1800s. So, what did NOLA look like back then? The territory itself became part of the US with the Louisiana Purchase, the massive land deal that we acquired from Napoleon and the French in 1803. But prior to this, the area was populated with a bunch of different people. Creoles, free men and women of all different colors, indentured white servants, and enslaved Africans and Afro-Caribbean men, women, and children. And Creoles, in this original context, means those that had French or Spanish ancestry, not the mix of things that it means today. It's similar to the Spanish and Portuguese colonial caste system. The Creoles were of European descent and were higher up in society than any of the mixed races, the indigenous, or the enslaved. The territory was originally a French settlement, hence New Orleans, named after the original Orleans, about 70 miles south-ish of Paris. But in 1763, New Orleans fell under Spanish rule. It then became French again for a short time before it, along with the rest of the Louisiana Purchase, was sold to the Americans. Like with most early settlements, some powerful families rose through the ranks and became the elite due to their wealth and their social status. Delphine came from one of these families, the McCartys, who were originally Irish, as their name might imply, though the earliest McCartys moved to France before Delphine and her family moved to New Orleans. But despite New Orleans being run by the Creoles, 3/4 of the population of the early settlement, at least, was made up of enslaved Africans, either directly from Africa or via the Caribbean. And a lot happened in the years between the settlement of New Orleans and the fire that broke out at the LaLaurie Mansion. Two main concerns had the people rattled. First, the fear of death by tropical diseases like yellow fever, and second, slave rebellions. Let's cover the disease first, because it's me, and that's my thing. Yellow fever is a virus that is spread through mosquitoes. It's not spread through coughing, sneezing, contact, anything like that. It's just a mosquito-transmitted viral infection. When an infected mosquito bites you, the virus in its saliva gets into your system and you contract the disease. It has the typical symptoms of viral infections: fever, chills, muscle pains, headaches, nausea, all of that good stuff, right? But why is it called yellow fever? We know that bubonic plague was because of the buboes, right? So does yellow fever imply that you become yellow? Yeah, actually. Victims can get jaundice, which is where your skin and eyes turn yellow, or at least get a yellowish tint to them. So that's how we know it's yellow fever instead of any of the other mosquito-borne illnesses like dengue. Now, it takes around 3 to 6 days after the initial infection to start seeing symptoms, and they can last 3 to 4 days at that point. Somewhere around 15% of patients with symptoms will worsen, and up to half of those patients will die. But it depends on the outbreak. Mortality rates can range between 20 to 60% of a population who gets infected. For example, an epidemic of yellow fever in New Orleans in 1853 killed around 8 to 12,000 people. This was around 8% of the city's population, which is pretty wild, and it was the highest death rate for any city suffering from yellow fever in the entire 19th century. Which, again, pretty wild. The majority of those who died were recent Irish immigrants. The existing population was a lot more immune to it, so this new group who didn't have any immunity to it, most of them were the ones who got infected. So that is a running fear that's happening in and around New Orleans in the 19th century. But it wasn't just that, it was also the constant fear of a slave rebellion. But this is something we saw in all slave-owning territories, right? I mean, when you dehumanize and belittle an entire population of people, then you probably should be afraid of any potential consequences. But there was an even heightened fear because of a different event that happened right around that period of time, the Haitian Revolution. I'll keep it brief, because I want to get to the murdery bits. A slave revolt erupted in 1791 on the French-owned island of Saint-Domingue. It was a complicated series of battles that involved enslaved men and women, free persons of color, colonists, black and white plantation owners, the French army, and more. It was the first and only successful large-scale slave revolt in history. In 1794, slavery in Saint Domingue was abolished by the French, marking a win for the Haitians. But Napoleon ended up reinstating slavery in 1802, primarily to make favor with the white plantation owners, but also to increase profits from the sugar trade, because Haiti was really big on growing sugar in their plantations. And that plunged this country into a second battle for freedom. I mean, can you imagine being freed only to become enslaved again because a guy across the ocean said so? No thanks. So the French army came over to fight this second revolution, if you will. Many of them died from yellow fever, though, because they didn't have immunity to it, and eventually they just withdrew and went back home to France. Instead of trying to earn money from their sugar plantations in Saint Domingue, because obviously that wasn't going to happen, France instead sold us the Louisiana Territory. They pocketed a couple $1,000,000, and we got a whole chunk of land. Saint Domingue became the Republic of Haiti on January 1st, 1804. So, there you go. The Louisiana Purchase, yellow fever, and the Haitian Revolution all tied together in one neat little historical package. I love it when that happens. But the success of the Haitian Revolution sent shockwaves through the slave-holding territories of the Atlantic, including New Orleans, which isn't all that far from Haiti, really, relatively, in the scheme of things. Slave owners relied on a series of rules and laws to govern the men, women, and children they considered their property, but these rules allowed for torture and bondage. The 1724 French Code Noir, or Black Code, forbade the killing or mutilating of slaves, which you would think is great. However, it did allow slave owners to beat and whip their slaves or chain them up if they deemed necessary. When New Orleans became Spanish for a hot minute, the Spanish version of the Black Code was a little bit more sympathetic to the enslaved, though it still allowed physical punishment. And then, once New Orleans became part of the US, the American Black Code followed suit and allowed the beatings and the bondage to continue. However, it also forbade slaves from being witnesses in court against whites. So, if a slave owner beat and abused them behind closed doors and nobody saw it except the slaves, they wouldn't be able to do anything about it. Well, legally, in court, anyway. It was a system that allowed for and propagated violence. And in this tense New Orleans climate, where there are fears about death by yellow fever and slave insurrections, some slave owners, like Delphine LaLaurie, took advantage of the law and seriously mistreated the human beings that they considered their property. See how hot my tea is today? Ooh, just right. So before we look at the real history, I thought it might be fun to take a look at the legend first, the bloody and gross stuff. You know, the things I love the most about this podcast. When the fire erupted at the LaLaurie Mansion, rescuers ran in to save whoever might be left behind, like the enslaved, who lived in separate slave quarters. Mansions like the one the LaLauries built would often have a main house in the very front of the property and a taller building in the back or connected to the back of the house where the kitchen and the slave quarters would be. The LaLaurie Mansion itself, at least at the time of the fire, not the one that was rebuilt that you can visit today, but at the time of the fire, it was only a 2-story house. But there was a taller service wing attached to the back where, again, the kitchen and slave quarters would be. So rescuers ran to those rooms to rescue anybody stuck there, and that is when they discovered the depths of Delphine LaLaurie's depravity. Here's a section from a book called The Haunted House of the Rue Royale, which means the Royal Street, published in 1946 by Jean Delavigne. And just a heads up, it's pretty nasty. The men who smashed the door saw powerful male slaves, stark naked, chained to the wall, their eyes gouged out, their fingernails pulled off by the roots. Others had their joints skinned and festering, great holes in their buttocks where the flesh had been sliced away, their ears hanging by shreds, their lips sewn together, or their tongues drawn out and sewed to their chins, severed hands stitched to their bellies, legs pulled joint from joint. Female slaves there were, their mouths and ears crammed with ashes and chicken offal and bound tightly. Others had been smeared with honey and were a mass of black ants. Intestines were pulled out and knotted around naked waists. There were holes in skulls where a rough stick had been inserted to stir the brains. Some of the poor creatures were dead, some were unconscious, and a few were still breathing, suffering agonies beyond any power to describe. Workmen began digging up human skeletons from under the house. They were found in all sorts of positions, helter-skelter, barely covered with soil, shreds of fabric still adhering to their bones. Some of the skulls had great holes in them. End quote. Now that is quite the story. Later iterations also include details like fingernail scratches underneath the floorboards of the house, indicating that some were buried alive. There were also stories that she had once chased one of her enslaved girls off the roof of the house. Now, the American Horror Story version of Delphine LaLaurie's story clearly pulled from these tales. A serial killer, a woman who tortured her slaves and used her power and status as a New Orleans socialite to get away with it until the fire exposed her to the community and she fled to avoid prosecution. But like the old saying goes, where there's smoke, there's fire, right? So these rumors and exaggerations had to come from somewhere. So let's take a look at the real story to see how much of that lines up with the legend. The rumors of her mistreating her slaves started with her third marriage to a young French doctor, Louis LaLaurie. She was twice widowed by that point, and no, she had nothing to do with her first two husbands' deaths. Her first husband was Ramon Lopez y Angulo de la Candelaria, a Spaniard who was made the intendant or administrator of New Orleans while it was under Spanish control. He died in a shipwreck near Havana. Her second husband was a Frenchman named Jean-Paul Blanc, who died at the age of 50 when Delphine was 28. Both of her first husbands were way older than she was, but that was more or less common back then. She was very wealthy when she met her third husband, LaLaurie, who was younger than her, by the way, and he moved from France to New Orleans to begin a career in orthopedics, more or less. He specialized in hunchbacks and curvy spines and wanted to begin a practice in New Orleans. But according to contemporary sources, the pair did not have a happy or stable marriage. They fought constantly, and Louis LaLaurie moved out and lived in a separate house for much of their time in New Orleans. One of the sources we have comes from Jean Bose, a socialite who knew the LaLauries and mentions them often in letters to his friends. And from Jean Bose, we also learn that Delphine LaLaurie was brought before the court once because of her cruelty to her slaves. Bose writes in a letter, quote, "Finally, justice descended on her home, and after being assured of the truth of the denunciations for barbarous treatment of her slaves, contrary to the law, the authorities found them still all bloody. She had them incarcerated, letting them be given only the bare necessities." End quote. The case never went anywhere, in part because there were no witnesses. Remember, the American Black Code prevented slaves from testifying as a witness against any whites in court. But funeral records show that at least 20 slaves died under Delphine's watch, almost all of them women and children. And if you listen to my recent episode on the Spanish Inquisition,
nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition,
then you might remember that the Catholic Church was very methodical with its record keeping, particularly with deaths. But what we don't know is how the enslaved died. Was it yellow fever? Or was it starvation and torture? The fire was covered by several newspapers at the time. The Creole-run Courier newspaper said that the fire started in the kitchen, set off by one of the older enslaved women who was tired of all of their mistreatment. The Courier reported that the upper part of the building, the slaves' quarters, was known to be a prison and that there were several slaves chained up there on the morning of the fire. Another Creole-run newspaper, The Bee, reported that, quote, "They found 7 slaves, more or less horribly mutilated, suspended by the neck with their limbs stretched and torn from one extremity to the other. They had been confined for several months in this situation and had merely been kept in existence to prolong their sufferings." End quote. The Courier also reported that one of the enslaved men, another quick quote, had a large hole in his head, his body from head to foot was covered with scars and filled with worms, end quote. And then an American-run newspaper, the Louisiana Advertiser, wrote that, quote, In digging up the yard, bodies have been disinterred, and a condemned well being uncovered, others, particularly that of a child, were found in it. End quote. But then a later article by the Louisiana Advertiser came out saying that none of LaLaurie's slaves were dead and no bodies were found buried at the property, which is strange that they would say one thing and then do the complete opposite. And if we just try to focus on these immediate contemporary sources, we already see a problem. Some were biased against LaLaurie, and some were in favor of her. And this is a problem we also saw with Lizzie Borden, who killed her father and stepmother with a hatchet later in the 19th century. This was the problem of political and social complexities essentially added to crimes when high society women are involved. We know, for instance, that Jean Bose was very much anti-LaLaurie. For whatever reason, he just didn't like her. And we can see that bias in his letters. But does that mean that she didn't abuse her slave just because people were biased against her? Evidence from the court case from before the fire seems to imply that she did abuse them, right? And we can corroborate Bose's claims about that court case because we know that she hired a trial attorney at the same time. And then the church records tell us that there were 20 deaths on her watch, if not more. Some may not have been buried and processed by the Catholic Church, as the interred body and the bodies in the well on her property suggest from the newspaper sources, right? We'll never really know how much was embellished. It is more than likely that she chained up and tortured her slaves, as was unfortunately allowed by the various legal codes governing the rights of slave owners against the enslaved. She probably felt emboldened to act this way. She might have taken her anger out on the slaves, primarily and particularly the women and children, as they were easier to mistreat. But all we can do is speculate based on the available evidence and the contemporary sources. But we also know that she treated some of her slaves well, like her loyal coachman, Bastien. The one that Kathy Bates turned into a minotaur in the show? Yeah, that was a weird plotline. There are also court records to show that she freed some of her slaves after 9 years or several years of service, like a Senegalese woman named Helene, who was her children's nursemaid. So she's all over the place. But it does seem like her violence picks up with her third marriage to Louis LaLaurie. We don't have any concrete evidence as to why. Perhaps it was just a crap marriage. Maybe there were heightened fears of yellow fever and slave insurrections, but we'll never really know. Bastien, the loyal coachman, helped Delphine and her family escape in the hours after the fire. They made it to France via New York, where they lived out the rest of their lives, and she died in Paris on December 7th, 1849. So in looking at this story, we're presented with another situation where a socialite woman definitely mistreated, tortured, and killed people, either directly or indirectly. I have no doubt about that. She operated within the law to confine and punish her slaves, for whatever reason, and sometimes towed that line, evidenced by the court case. She made friends and enemies among the New Orleans socialites, and when the fire exposed her, she fled, which only, of course, fueled the rumors about her actions. Something similar happened to Elizabeth Bathory in the 14th century, a story, or, in the medieval period, if you will. A story I mentioned earlier in the episode and was the subject of an early AF-Out episode. Both cases feature high society women who abused their power and definitely committed violent acts against their slaves and or servants, but whose stories are greatly exaggerated. And those exaggerated stories are the ones told to tourists and ghost story aficionados. I like how Ghost City Tours puts it on their website, quote, "Are you noticing some similarities here? It seems as if, over time, someone decided that they'll simply retell the stories about Elizabeth Bathory and apply them to Madame LaLaurie. It all sounds a bit like tour guides and storytellers are simply recycling ghost stories from other cities or countries." But as Carolyn Moreau-Long summarizes in her book, quote, "The evidence against the lady is strong. The testimony of numerous credible witnesses has persuaded me that the story of the fire, the abused slaves, and the attack on the LaLaurie Mansion by the mob is fundamentally true, and that Madame LaLaurie was indeed guilty of the crimes of which she is accused." End quote. And I agree. And while we know that torture, confinement, and death happened at Delphine LaLaurie's murder mansion, the truth is a lot less gruesome than the fiction. Thank you for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelly Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of the Delphine LaLaurie murder mansion. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't already checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. You can also support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up A Popular History of Unpopular Things and subscribe to AFOUT on YouTube. You should also go listen to Nedrick, my editor and the musician behind my intro and outro song, Yellow Cake. You can find his stuff wherever you get your music, and links to all of those things I just mentioned are right below. Be sure to follow my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.